At 0:50 a.m. local time, high above the frozen Siberian wilderness, Aeroflot Flight 593 was flying through one of the quietest stretches of its journey, an uneventful cruise that should have remained indistinguishable from any other night crossing. Inside the Airbus A310, the cabin lights were dim, passengers were resting, and the aircraft's systems were operating with the cold precision expected of modern aviation. Nothing, absolutely nothing, hinted at the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Yet in that stillness, the seeds of disaster had already taken root. They did not begin with mechanical failure or a burst of turbulence. They began with a moment of human warmth, a father's pride, and a cockpit atmosphere that felt too safe for its own good. Captain Andrei Danilov, respected within the company and admired by his peers, had invited his two children to experience the cockpit during the long-haul flight to Hong Kong. It was not unusual for Soviet-era culture, now transitioning into modern Russian aviation, to carry remnants of informal practices. The cockpit was a symbol of status, and sharing it with family was something some pilots still considered harmless. Tonight, however, harmless would become fatal. While the captain rested, First Officer Yaroslav Kudrinsky, a competent and self-assured aviator, assumed command alongside relief pilot Igor Piskaryov. Both men were comfortable. Both trusted the aircraft's automation, and both believed they remained firmly in control. The Airbus A310, tail number FOGQS, cruised steadily through the night. Its autopilot held the aircraft perfectly level, maintaining altitude and heading while the engines breathed power into the frozen air. Kudrinsky, proud and relaxed, allowed his son and daughter to take turns in the left seat, the captain's seat. The children were thrilled, fascinated by the illuminated panels and the surreal sensation of sitting at the controls of a commercial airliner. The boy, especially confident, placed his hands on the control column. Kudrinsky encouraged him lightly. After all, autopilot was engaged. The aircraft wouldn't respond to minor pressure. At least, that is what he believed. But the A310's automation had design nuances that required deep familiarity and constant vigilance. The autopilot could resist some manual pressure, but only up to a certain threshold. Past that point, the lateral control channel, the system responsible for maintaining roll, would silently disengage. It was not a dramatic failure. No alarm, no flashing light, no audible chime. A subtle, almost invisible shift in authority. And at this hour, with the crew distracted and comfortable, subtle would be more dangerous than explosive. The boy continued pressing against the control column, applying lateral force he assumed was harmless. Kudrinsky, unaware, continued to smile. Piskaryov, seated behind, monitored casually but without the vigilance required for an active flight deck. The autopilot's roll channel disconnected. The aircraft began a slow, creeping left bank. 5 degrees, then 8, then 10. The instruments reflected the change, but the crew misinterpreted the readings as nothing concerning. The children giggled at the sensation, believing they were steering the plane. In reality, the aircraft was slipping into an aerodynamic attitude from which recovery would soon become progressively more complex. The autopilot still held altitude, masking the growing roll. This false stability allowed the situation to escalate unnoticed. As the bank angle increased, the wings produced less vertical lift. To maintain altitude, the aircraft required more lift than the wings could generate at that attitude. The autopilot compensated briefly, but physics would not be negotiated with. The roll became self-reinforcing. Aerodynamic forces pulled the aircraft deeper into the turn. It was at this moment, in the quiet glow of cockpit instrumentation, that the real crisis began, not with panic, but with confusion. Kudrinsky finally noticed the bank. He attempted to correct by applying opposite pressure. But now, the autopilot was no longer commanding the roll axis. The aircraft's response felt unfamiliar, even contradictory. Instead of leveling smoothly, it resisted. The control forces felt different, almost delayed, as if something inside the aircraft had shifted into an unexpected configuration. What is it doing? Kudrinsky wondered aloud. His tone carried uncertainty, but not yet fear. His daughter sat behind him, unaware of the subtle tension building. His son, still smiling, released the control column. But the damage had been done. The roll had reached a critical point. and the crew did not fully understand that the autopilot was no longer holding the aircraft steady. This lack of understanding, this gap in situational awareness, was the first unmistakable fracture in their cockpit resource management. As the bank angle passed 25 degrees, the aerodynamic load on the aircraft increased sharply. The nose began to drop. The autopilot, still managing pitch, tried to maintain altitude by pulling back. But with the wings partially turned away from the vertical, the aircraft could not maintain lift. The nose was sinking despite the autopilot's efforts. To the crew, the aircraft now appeared to behave erratically, as though the flight computer were malfunctioning. In reality, the plane was responding exactly as physics dictated. The crew simply didn't know which system was in control. The moment the nose began to drop marked the loss of the safety bubble that had protected Flight 593 until now. Kudrinsky disengaged the autopilot entirely, believing it to be the source of the strange behavior. But once disconnected, the aircraft's attitude, now significantly banked and nose down, became fully manual, demanding immediate, coordinated correction. Yet neither pilot had processed the aircraft's true orientation. Their internal models of the situation were broken. CRM was deteriorating rapidly. Communication was incomplete. Roles were blurred. And the aircraft's rate of descent was accelerating. The cockpit voice recorder would later reveal the moment clarity turned into shock. Kudrinsky suddenly realized the aircraft was banking steeply and losing altitude at an alarming rate. He shouted for control. Piskaryov tried to assist, but overlapping inputs on the A310, where both side sticks moved together mechanically, created further confusion. The aircraft's bank angle reached 40 degrees, then 50. The nose dropped even further. The altimeter unwound like a clock falling down a staircase. Passengers in the cabin began to feel a strange pressure lifting them slightly from their seats as the aircraft's attitude shifted. The cabin crew felt the floor tilt. Unsecured items slid. And in the cockpit, the children, now terrified, were pushed back by the forces acting on the aircraft. The aircraft entered a spiraling descent. The world outside the cockpit windows tilted into a horizon of blackness and frozen terrain. The pilots, overwhelmed, attempted to recover by pulling back, an instinctive reaction that in this configuration only worsened the stall risk. Airspeed fluctuated violently. The aircraft crossed structural boundaries never intended for sustained flight. And yet, amid the chaos, there was a moment of near recovery. Kudrinsky managed to level the wings briefly after the aircraft plunged through several thousand feet. But the altitude lost was staggering, and their situational awareness shattered. With adrenaline surging, control inputs became increasingly aggressive, destabilizing the aircraft once again. The A310 pitched upward sharply, inducing a high-speed stall. The stall alarm blared. The aircraft rolled over uncontrollably and entered a secondary dive, one from which no modern airliner could recover at such low altitude. The final seconds were a violent blur of warnings, shouted commands, frantic corrections, and crushing G-forces. The aircraft descended almost vertically into the remote mountains near Kemerovo. At 0:57 a.m., Aeroflot Flight 593 impacted the ground with catastrophic force, killing all 75 people on board. The remains of the aircraft scattered across the rugged landscape, illuminated only by the fireball rising against the darkness. The Siberian night swallowed the noise quickly, a tragedy born not from mechanical failure, but from a sequence of human decisions, small, well-intentioned, and seemingly harmless, interacting with automation in ways the crew did not understand, compounded by a breakdown in cockpit discipline and CRM. At first light, when rescue teams began reaching the remote slopes of the Kuznetsk-Alatow Mountains, the wreckage of Aeroflot Flight 593 spread across the frozen terrain like a brutal reminder of the night's events. Metal fragments, torn wiring, scattered luggage, and the remnants of the A310's wings lay half-buried in snow and earth. The pattern of debris told investigators something unmistakable. The aircraft had impacted almost vertically, at extreme speed, with no signs of controlled flight. But the most urgent question, the one that would haunt the early hours, was why a perfectly functioning Airbus had fallen from the sky without issuing a single distress call. There was no weather threat, no mechanical anomaly, no external factor to justify the sudden plunge. This silence, this lack of warning, disturbed investigators from the very beginning. Aircraft rarely crash without a chain of identifiable failures, but here, the conventional checklist of catastrophe offered no easy answers. It was not until recovery teams found the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, buried under twisted structure and scorched insulation, that the truth would begin emerging piece by devastating piece. Back in Moscow, Aeroflot officials and government representatives held urgent briefings. The anxiety was palpable. The airline was in the middle of a modernization effort, transitioning from Soviet-era aircraft to Western-built models like the Airbus A310, aiming to rebuild international credibility. A catastrophic loss of one of its newest aircraft threatened both lives and reputation. The possibility of a mechanical malfunction in the A310, a model trusted globally, was alarming. Yet as Airbus engineers reviewed telemetry data from the aircraft's maintenance logs, nothing pointed toward a system failure. Everything appeared nominal prior to the crash. Meanwhile, in a forensic laboratory, investigators began decoding the CVR. The first minutes were routine, call-outs, altitude checks, casual conversation among the crew. And then, unexpectedly, the voices of children. Investigators froze the tape. They played it again. The sound was unmistakable. A boy and a girl inside the cockpit, speaking excitedly, laughing, asking questions. Then came a conversation between Kudrinsky and his son, lighthearted, proud, totally at odds with international flight deck protocols. This revelation struck with the force of a hammer. Children inside the cockpit during cruise was a severe breach of procedure, one the industry had worked for decades to eliminate. But investigators needed to be careful. The presence of children did not automatically explain the crash. They continued listening, minute by minute, building a timeline of cockpit events. They heard Kudrinsky encourage his son to sit in the left seat. Then the faint rustle of movement. Then the moment the boy touched the control column. Laughter, a small shift in tone. Then Kudrinsky pointing out instruments. More giggles. But midway through this seemingly harmless exchange, the investigators heard something subtle in the background, a slight fluctuation in engine tone. Not large enough to alarm a passenger, but to trained ears, it indicated a deviation in the aircraft's attitude, likely a bank angle increase. They replayed that section multiple times, comparing it with the flight data recorder. A timeline emerged. The boy had unintentionally pushed the control column to the side. The autopilot's roll channel disengaged silently. The aircraft began banking, and the adults in the cockpit, unaware of the partial disconnection, allowed the trend to continue until it escalated beyond manageable limits. For the investigative team, the implications were staggering. They realized the crew did not detect the autopilot's lateral disconnect. Worse still, they misinterpreted the aircraft's responses, assuming the autopilot remained engaged. In a well-disciplined cockpit, CRM procedures require constant cross-verification, monitoring instruments, challenging decisions, confirming assumptions. But here, CRM had eroded under informal behavior and distractions. The presence of children fundamentally altered the psychological dynamic on the flight deck. A space that required strict hierarchy and procedural rigor had shifted into a relaxed environment where norms blurred. The CVR continued. They heard Kudrinsky instructing his son to release the controls. Then the moment he noticed the bank. His voice shifted from calm to puzzled, a tone investigators knew well, the onset of cognitive dissonance. The aircraft's behavior no longer matched what he expected. Then came the first verbal acknowledgement. What is it doing? Marking the point at which situational awareness fractured. Once the autopilot was disconnected completely, chaos ensued. Investigators listened to the pilots wrestling with the controls, overlapping commands, and inconsistent inputs. The A310 required coordinated control movements to recover from unusual attitudes, but the pilots, shocked and disoriented, reacted with instinct rather than precision. The CVR recorded intense breathing, shouts, the sound of the stall warning, and the altimeter's decreasing tones. But one moment stood out, a chilling turning point. After plunging thousands of feet, Kudrinsky managed to level the wings. For a brief few seconds, the aircraft was recoverable. Had they maintained that attitude and applied measured corrections, Flight 593 might have survived. But human factors intervened once more. Disoriented by the violent descent and lacking a clear mental picture of the aircraft's situation, the pilots overcorrected. Pitch inputs became excessive. The nose rose too sharply. Airspeed decayed. The aircraft entered a high-angle stall. And from that point, with mountains rushing toward them and only seconds remaining, the final dive began. Once the CVR concluded, the room remained silent. Not the routine professional silence of investigators at work, but a cold, heavy stillness. A shared acknowledgement of a tragedy born not from malfunction, but from a sequence of preventable human decisions. The children's presence, the relaxed atmosphere, the misunderstanding of automation, the breakdown of CRM, each one, individually small, had combined into an unstoppable chain reaction. Next, investigators examined the flight data recorder. The numbers and graphs confirmed what the audio suggested: a gradual bank increase leading to a steep roll, followed by an aerodynamic dive, a momentary recovery, then a secondary stall leading to impact. They compared the data with the Airbus A310 systems and design. The autopilot had performed exactly as programmed. It had disengaged its roll channel only when significant manual pressure was applied. It had attempted to maintain altitude as long as aerodynamically possible, and it had not malfunctioned in any way. The aircraft itself was innocent. The final investigative report would conclude that the root cause of the accident was a breakdown in cockpit discipline and CRM, triggered by the unauthorized presence of children in the cockpit and the crew's failure to monitor flight parameters. The partial autopilot disengagement, misunderstood by the pilots, created a loss of situational awareness that rapidly compounded. For families of the victims, the truth was devastating. It is one thing to lose a loved one to weather, mechanical failure, or an unavoidable act of fate. It is another to learn that the tragedy resulted from a moment of informal behavior, a breach of professionalism that should never have occurred. Aeroflot faced intense public scrutiny. International aviation authorities demanded accountability, and the case became a global lesson in CRM training. But beyond procedural reforms, investigators understood something deeper. The human brain, under the illusion of automation and safety, is vulnerable. Distraction, complacency, and emotional decisions, even small ones, can infiltrate the sterile environment of a cockpit and turn routine flight into disaster. The presence of a child did not just introduce an unauthorized variable. It shifted the psychological authority structure. The pilots unintentionally placed emotional comfort above operational discipline. The cockpit ceased to function as a professional workspace, and the chain reaction began. As the investigation progressed, aviation agencies re-examined their automation interface training. Many pilots worldwide did not fully understand partial autopilot disengagement modes. The Aeroflot case highlighted the dangers of assuming the aircraft was doing what the pilot believed it should do. It underscored the necessity of cross-monitoring, verification, and challenging assumptions, core pillars of CRM. In the years that followed, the accident became a mandatory case study for airlines around the globe. Training sessions dissected the crew's mental state, their distraction, and their moment-to-moment decision errors. The emphasis was not on blame, but on understanding how easily human factors can erode even in apparently quiet moments of flight. The A310's design was reviewed, and while no mechanical fault was found, Airbus emphasized the importance of clear autopilot disengagement indicators. Many airlines implemented stricter rules prohibiting cockpit visitors, reinforcing a discipline that modern aviation now considers non-negotiable. Though the wreckage was cleared and the investigation concluded, the legacy of Flight 593 lived on, not as a tale of failure, but as a global reminder. Technology cannot compensate for inattention. Automation cannot fix miscommunication. And a cockpit, no matter how comfortable or stable it may seem, is never a place for anything less than absolute discipline. At sunrise on the day after the crash, as international media began circulating the first reports of Aeroflot Flight 593's disappearance, aviation analysts around the world were already attempting to piece together what might have happened. Speculation ranged from catastrophic mechanical failure to severe turbulence to sudden depressurization. The possibility that human factors, especially those involving unauthorized cockpit access, had played a central role did not yet exist in the public consciousness. But inside Russia, Among the investigative teams and Aeroflot's executive leadership, the truth was beginning to crystallize with unsettling clarity. They now possessed enough CVR and FDR data to understand that the aircraft had never suffered a mechanical malfunction. The downfall of Flight 593 was rooted entirely in human hands, human assumptions, and human distraction. Yet understanding the specifics required more than data points. Investigators needed to reconstruct the cockpit environment as precisely as possible. They created a timeline of actions based on CVR timestamps, matching every voice and sound against the aircraft's attitude changes. They reviewed every system reaction, every moment the autopilot retained or relinquished authority, every second of pitch, roll, and yaw variation. They replayed the cockpit audio to identify tone shifts, moments where the voice of a trained aviator gave way to confusion, where confidence dissolved into disbelief. One of the most striking findings was the subtlety of the initial deviation. When the boy applied lateral force to the control column, the autopilot disengaged only on the roll axis. It maintained altitude and speed, hiding the destabilization until the bank angle became large enough to override the aircraft's automatic corrections. This design behavior was not flawed. However, it required pilots to recognize partial disengagement immediately by monitoring instruments and enunciations. In this cockpit, where attention was divided between professional duties and informal interaction with children, those cues were missed. To illustrate this sequence, investigators constructed a simulator recreation using Airbus A310 data inputs. As the simulation rolled slowly left under slight manual pressure, the crew initially failed to perceive the change, just as the real crew had. Instruments began reflecting the drift clearly around 10 degrees of bank, yet cognitive bias interfered. The crew believed the autopilot was still engaged, so they interpreted the readings as instrument quirks or natural flight variation. This assumption persisted despite clear indications that the aircraft had transitioned into semi-manual flight. The moment that assumption fractured, the moment Kudrinsky finally realized the roll was not self-correcting, was the exact moment CRM should have come into full force. A standard operating environment would have seen immediate declaration of control, confirmation of autopilot status, cross-checking between pilots, and coordinated recovery inputs. None of that happened. Instead, the cockpit environment, compromised by distraction and the presence of children, triggered a rapid transition from lightheartedness to disorientation. The pilots reacted individually, even competitively, rather than as a unified team. For investigators, this breakdown was a textbook example of how CRM collapses under the weight of cognitive overload. The crew's emotional state changed abruptly. A moment earlier, they had been in a relaxed, semi-informal atmosphere. Now they were facing an unexpected aircraft attitude, with incomplete understanding of what systems were active. The child, now frightened, created an additional emotional layer that hindered the pilot's ability to compartmentalize their focus. Stress levels surged, narrowing their field of attention, a phenomenon known in aviation psychology as tunneling. This narrowing contributed directly to their misinterpretation of the aircraft's behavior after the autopilot was fully disengaged. The A310, under significant bank and beginning to nose down, required coordinated aileron and rudder inputs along with controlled pitch correction. Instead, abrupt and instinctive pulling on the yoke worsened the situation. The aircraft's speed and angle of attack fluctuated dangerously as aerodynamics began imposing severe penalties for imprecise control. The investigation team produced a detailed analysis showing how the aircraft could have been saved at several points. The initial recovery opportunity appeared when the aircraft had only reached moderate bank. At that stage, a simple leveling maneuver, gentle, coordinated, and aligned with standard unusual attitude recovery procedures, would have returned the plane to stable flight. The second opportunity came after the steep dive. Despite the terrifying descent, the aircraft's structural resilience and aerodynamic design allowed Kudrinsky to momentarily regain level wings. But here, cognitive overload and incomplete situational awareness again played a decisive role. The pilots were disoriented by the aircraft's attitude, altitude loss, and airspeed fluctuations. They lacked a mental model of what the aircraft needed. Instead of stabilizing gradually, They applied excessive pitch-up inputs, pushing the aircraft into a secondary stall from which recovery at their low altitude was impossible. To better understand the pilot's mindset, investigators turned to human factors specialists and aviation psychologists. They identified several cognitive traps present on Flight 593. 1. Automation complacency. The pilots trusted the autopilot excessively. They believed it would prevent unsafe attitudes, not realizing it had partially disengaged. 2. Authority gradient inversion. The presence of the captain's children in the cockpit shifted the psychological dynamic. Kudrinsky may have felt compelled to project control and confidence, suppressing doubts or hesitations. 3. Task saturation. Once the aircraft deviated significantly from normal flight, their cognitive bandwidth collapsed. Emotional stress, amplified by the presence of children, further eroded their capacity for systematic problem-solving. 4. Confirmation bias. They interpreted the aircraft's evolving behavior through the assumption that the autopilot remained engaged, delaying recognition of the emergency. 5. Breakdown of division of duties. Both pilots attempted to control the aircraft simultaneously at various points, creating chaotic control inputs instead of coordinated CRM-based response. These insights were not an accusation. They were a sobering reminder that even experienced, highly trained crews can become vulnerable when procedure is abandoned, discipline is relaxed, and stress compounds with unexpected variables. The tragedy of Flight 593 was not attributed to negligence in the malicious sense, but to a cascading series of human errors that any cockpit, without strict adherence to protocol, could replicate. Public reaction intensified once the investigative findings became known. The revelation that children had been allowed in the cockpit shocked families, regulators, and international observers. Aeroflot faced fierce criticism, some directed specifically at the crew, some broadly at Russian aviation culture, which at the time was still transitioning from Soviet-era practices to globally standardized norms. Internally, Aeroflot carried out its own review. Leadership recognized that while individual crew decisions were central to the accident, systemic factors also played a role. There had been insufficient emphasis on Western-style CRM during transition training. Automation interface training had not thoroughly addressed partial autopilot disengagement scenarios. And cockpit access protocols, while formally aligned with international rules, had not been culturally internalized. This accident revealed that compliance on paper is meaningless when behavior in operation diverges. International aviation bodies, including ICAO and IATA, took the findings seriously. Workshops and symposiums dissected the event as an unprecedented case study of partial automation misunderstanding combined with CRM failure. Many airlines worldwide updated their CRM training curricula to include the psychological risks posed by informality in the cockpit. The emphasis grew not only on procedures, but on the mindset required to maintain them consistently, even during low workload phases. A particularly impactful segment of the final report detailed how quickly Flight 593 transitioned from routine to unrecoverable. From the moment the buoy applied pressure to the control column to the aircraft's first steep dive was less than 2 minutes. From recovery to secondary stall, less than 1 minute. From stall to ground impact, seconds. These timelines underscored the brutal speed with which human factors incidents can escalate, far faster than mechanical ones. This insight reshaped training philosophy worldwide. The accident also led to specific recommendations regarding autopilot enunciation clarity. While the A310 met all certification standards, the subtlety of partial disengagement had played a real-world role in pilot confusion. Airbus worked with regulatory bodies to improve documentation, training guidance, families of the and victims, pilot awareness desperate of automation for answers, boundaries. Attended public briefings where investigators presented their conclusions with solemn transparency. Many wept upon learning that the disaster stemmed not from sabotage or unavoidable failure, but from a moment of human informality, a gesture of affection turned tragic. The pain was indescribable. Yet for aviation, the lesson was indelible. Flight decks must remain sterile environments, impermeable to emotional influence and non-essential activity. As the investigation closed, Flight 593 became one of the most cited CRM case studies in the world. Not for malice, not for incompetence, but for the devastating clarity with which it illustrated the fragility of human judgment under the illusion of safety. The wreckage was eventually cleared. Memorials were erected. But in the training rooms of airlines across continents, the voices captured on the CVR live on not as haunting artifacts, but as teaching tools meant to reinforce a single truth. Even the smallest deviation from discipline can awaken a chain of errors impossible to contain once set in motion. At the edge of the Siberian crash site, investigators continued combing through the barren terrain for any remaining fragments that could provide deeper insight into the final moments of Aeroflot Flight 593. Although the primary cause was already understood, every shard of wreckage, every recovered component, and every trace of cockpit instrumentation would serve to corroborate the sequence of events captured on the recorders. The vertical impact had pulverized most of the aircraft, compressing sections of fuselage and cockpit structure into unrecognizable forms. Yet, remarkably, some flight instruments survived well enough to confirm what the data already showed: an aircraft pushed past its aerodynamic limits by pilots lost in an escalating battle against physics, automation misinterpretation, and their own cognitive overload. Engineers from Airbus arrived to participate in the analysis, not out of suspicion toward the aircraft's systems, but out of responsibility. Whenever a Western-built aircraft crashed, manufacturers needed to verify that no design factor contributed to the event. They examined the autopilot servos, control linkages, and recovered fragments of the flight control computer. The results reinforced the same conclusion at every turn. The aircraft had operated exactly as designed until the moment it exceeded structural and aerodynamic boundaries. The root cause remained entirely in the realm of human factors. Still, Airbus engineers provided valuable context. They highlighted how partial autopilot disengagement required pilots to monitor enunciations closely, training that Western pilots typically performed recurrently, but that Aeroflot's transitioning crews had not yet fully internalized. Automation, while powerful, carried inherent risk when misunderstood. In the wrong conditions, a human assumption could override a computer's logic, opening the door to disaster. The A310's interface was not deficient. It was simply unfamiliar to crews accustomed to the Soviet-era systems that behaved radically differently. As these findings circulated among specialists, attention turned to the psychological environment inside the cockpit. Human factors researchers reconstructed the mental landscape that Kudrinsky and Kaskaryov likely experienced. The shift from relaxed conversation with children to emergency response was abrupt, leaving no buffer for the crew to compose themselves. This abrupt transition is known in aviation psychology as an affective pivot, an emotional swing so sudden that it disrupts cognitive continuity. Pilots rely heavily on this continuity to maintain situational awareness. When broken, they struggle to form an accurate mental model of the aircraft state. This breakdown was evident in the pilot's control inputs throughout the flight path reconstruction. As the aircraft rolled left uncontrollably, the crew applied corrective pressure, but with poor synchronization. When one pilot attempted to counter-roll, the other inadvertently offset some portion of that input. In Airbus aircraft, sidesticks would have operated independently, but the A310, an earlier generation, used mechanically linked control columns. The redundancy should have helped unify pilot efforts. Instead, the overlapping responses compounded the confusion, showing how deeply disoriented the crew was. The investigation also explored the broader socio-cultural context of Aeroflot's operational environment. In 1994, Russian aviation was undergoing major transformation. Pilots were shifting from Soviet-built aircraft, which required heavy manual flying, to Western-designed models optimized around automation. This transition was not merely technical, it was psychological. The introduction of automation changed the nature of pilot duties from hands-on control to monitoring, decision-making, and oversight. Pilots needed new mental models for their relationship with the aircraft, new instincts, and new reflexes. Aeroflot's training program had not yet matured to the standards necessary for Western aircraft integration. Flight 593 became the turning point that forced the airline to accelerate this evolution. Further analysis revealed critical points where proper CRM protocols could have broken the chain of errors. In a well-functioning cockpit team, the non-flying pilot would monitor instruments, challenge assumptions, and assist with troubleshooting. Here, the presence of children, combined with a relaxed atmosphere, diminished the roles of both pilots. The sterile cockpit rule, designed to eliminate non-essential activity, was effectively abandoned. Without hierarchy, without clear division of duties, and without mutual cross-checking, the cockpit devolved into an informal space precisely when professionalism was most critical. As investigators reconstructed the final seconds of flight with precision, one insight stood out as particularly unsettling. The pilots were astonishingly close to recovery after the first dive. The wings had been leveled. Airspeed, though high, remained within survivable bounds. If the crew had paused, breathed, reassessed their instrumentation, and applied measured corrections, the A310 might have climbed out of danger. But the psychological impact of the dive was overwhelming. The pilots, shaken and confused, responded based on instinct rather than training. They pulled back aggressively, triggering the deadly secondary stall. This moment became a cornerstone example in CRM courses worldwide. Recovery opportunities are useless if pilots are too overwhelmed to recognize them. Meanwhile, the families of the victims struggled with grief compounded by the nature of the accident. The idea that children in the cockpit, allowed there out of affection rather than recklessness, had triggered the chain of events was devastating. Aeroflot offered support to families, but public outrage intensified. The airline released statements promising sweeping reforms. International regulators pressured Russia to bring its training programs into alignment with global standards. There was no question that Aeroflot needed immediate modernization, not only in equipment, but in culture. In Hong Kong, where the flight was scheduled to land, airport staff prepared reception areas for grieving families. Counselors were brought in. International diplomats coordinated repatriation efforts. For many relatives, the incomprehensible nature of the tragedy led to painful questions. Why was there no distress call? Why did the aircraft plunge so suddenly? Why did modern systems fail to save them? The answers, delivered slowly over months, brought little comfort. Yet they carried critical weight for the aviation industry. Over time, Aeroflot implemented one of the most significant CRM reforms in modern aviation history. The airline partnered with Western consultants to overhaul its training curriculum. Emphasis on cockpit hierarchy, division of duties, communication protocols, and automation awareness became central to every simulator session. Cockpit access rules were reinforced with zero-tolerance policies. Pilots underwent immersive human factors training designed to deepen their understanding of cognitive limitations under stress. The company invested in restructuring its safety management culture, making procedural discipline non-negotiable. Globally, Flight 593 became a mandatory case study in pilot training programs. Simulator instructors recreated the partial autopilot disengagement scenario to teach pilots how rapidly unnoticed deviations can become fatal. Aviation psychologists dissected the event to understand how informal cockpit atmospheres undermine professional boundaries. Airlines worldwide used Flight 593 as a sobering reminder that automation does not eliminate the need for vigilance. If anything, it increases it. When pilots misunderstand automation logic, they lose their ability to intervene effectively when it matters most. This global shift reflected a deeper truth. Human factors, not mechanical failures, had become the leading cause of aviation accidents. Pilots needed not only technical proficiency, but emotional resilience, communication skills, and mastery of workload management. Cockpit resource management became more than a guideline. It became a philosophy. Back in Siberia, the crash site eventually grew quiet. Snow reclaimed the scars on the earth. Wildlife returned. The mountains absorbed the memory of the disaster into their silence. But Flight 593 did not fade from aviation history. Its lessons echoed far beyond the wreckage. They shaped training policies, cockpit protocols, regulatory standards, and the psychology of flight crews for decades. Even today, when pilots train for unusual attitude recovery or review automation boundary scenarios, the specter of Flight 593 stands behind every lesson. Its voice recorder, once a source of unbearable grief, now serves as a testament to the critical importance of discipline, focus, and CRM. Its tragedy underscores a brutal reality. Aviation safety depends as much on the human mind as it does on metal and software. And when human vigilance fails, even the most advanced aircraft cannot compensate. The legacy of Flight 593 is thus not only one of loss, but of transformation. It reshaped an airline, influenced global training standards, and reinforced the unbreakable rule that the cockpit is a sacred space, reserved for duty, discipline, and nothing else. At the International Aviation Seminar held months after the crash of Aeroflot Flight 593, a quiet tension filled the auditorium. Experts from around the world gathered to dissect the final investigation report, a document that blended technical rigor with profound human tragedy. It was clear that this accident, though horrifying, carried lessons of enormous value, lessons that would alter the trajectory of aviation safety for decades. The report did not just describe what happened. It exposed how a series of human decisions, each seemingly small, accumulated into the irreversible. As the lead investigator stepped to the podium, he summarized the chain of events with a clarity that resonated deeply. This was not a story of mechanical collapse or catastrophic failure of technology. This was a story of distraction, of complacency, of the fragile boundary between professionalism and informality. The presence of children in the cockpit did not simply violate procedure. It introduced an emotional variable into a sterile environment, shifting the crew's mindset from operational vigilance to parental pride. The investigation demonstrated that the accident began long before the aircraft entered its fatal dive, long before the autopilot disconnected. It began with the erosion of cockpit discipline. One of the most powerful statements in the report emphasized that pilots must treat every moment of flight as part of an unbroken chain of responsibility. Relaxation, while natural, cannot dilute awareness. Automation may reduce workload, but it does not eliminate the need for constant monitoring. Aviation's modern safety net depends on layers of redundancy, human and mechanical. When humans step outside their role, the net tears. The families of the victims, seated in the hall, listened as the conclusions were delivered with solemn respect. Many wept quietly. For them, these lessons came at a cost no words could justify. But even in grief, some took comfort in knowing that their loved ones' deaths would spark reforms protecting future passengers around the world. The idea that their loss could prevent future tragedies gave meaning where otherwise there would have been only darkness. One of the investigators presented an in-depth analysis of CRM failures aboard Flight 593. The breakdown was not isolated to a single moment. It unfolded as a progressive decline in discipline. First, allowing children into the cockpit. Second, shifting attention from instruments to informal conversation. Third, overlooking the initial role deviation. Fourth, misinterpreting the aircraft's behavior due to cognitive bias. And finally, failing to coordinate during attempts at recovery. Each step represented a crack in the foundation. Together, they collapsed the entire structure of cockpit integrity. The investigator described how the pilot's communication pattern changed after the children entered the cockpit. Phrases became casual. Monitoring cross-checks diminished. Hierarchical structure dissolved. The cockpit, which should have been an environment of precision, shifted into one of relaxed interaction. These nuances were subtle but devastating. They created the psychological conditions necessary for distraction to override skill. A human factors specialist followed with an explanation of how emotional context affects pilot decision-making. He noted that the presence of children introduces cognitive interference, even subconsciously. Pilots may become protective, preoccupied, or eager to impress. These emotional responses, perfectly normal in everyday life, are incompatible with the demands of flight operations. The sterile cockpit rule exists precisely because even the smallest emotional shift can alter judgment under high workload or sudden stress. The final report included extensive recommendations. Aeroflot, to its credit, embraced these reforms with urgency. Within months, cockpit access policies were rewritten to align with the strictest international standards. No non-operational visitors. No exceptions. Security protocols reinforced these rules with physical barriers. Flight deck doors remained locked, and only authorized personnel could enter. CRM training underwent a complete overhaul. Aeroflot adopted ICAO standard CRM modules emphasizing communication discipline, workload management, decision-making under pressure, and cross-verification of assumptions. The airline integrated Western-style automation awareness training, ensuring pilots understood the boundaries and behavior of autopilot systems. Aeroflot also invested in recurrent simulator sessions designed to replicate partial automation disengagement, unusual attitude recovery, and rapid onset emergencies. Scenarios that Flight 593 had turned into global cautionary lessons. Internationally, airlines and regulators responded as well. CRM, once treated as supplemental training, became central to pilot qualification programs. Pilots would now repeatedly train for situations where automation fails partially, requiring immediate recognition and intervention. The aviation community recognized that technology alone cannot guarantee safety. Humans remain the final safeguard, and their performance depends on discipline, communication, and awareness. Beyond procedural reforms, Flight 593 influenced psychological training within aviation. Pilots were taught about cognitive traps, fixation, tunneling, confirmation bias, emotional overload, and automation complacency. Training programs emphasize that recognizing mental state is as critical as recognizing aircraft state. Pilots learn not only how to control aircraft, but how to control themselves. The accident also triggered improvements in aircraft design documentation. Although Airbus found no fault with the A310 systems, they collaborated with regulators to emphasize clearer training on autopilot modes. The subtlety of partial disengagement, not easily audible or visually prominent, became a point of discussion in training manuals and CRM sessions worldwide. The aviation community recalibrated its understanding of automation, what it can do, what it cannot do, and most importantly, how pilots must monitor it. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Kemerovo, the crash site became a somber memorial. Families visited the location, leaving flowers and letters among the remnants of scorched metal. Some left toys, symbols of the children lost in the tragedy. For others, simply standing on the ground where the aircraft impacted was a way of reclaiming a piece of their loved one's final journey. Years passed, and Aeroflot evolved into one of the safest airlines in the world, a transformation often attributed to the harsh lessons of Flight 593. Its internal culture shifted fundamentally. Pilots became advocates of rigorous CRM. Training standards rose dramatically. New generations of aviators studied the accident not with judgment, but with reverence. They understood that Flight 593 represented the cost of complacency, the fragility of human attention, and the importance of unwavering discipline. In aviation schools, instructors used the case as a defining example of human factors. Students listened to portions of the CVR, not for drama, but to understand the humanity and vulnerability behind the controls. They learned how quickly a routine flight can unravel. They learned how psychology intertwines with procedure. They learned that the cockpit is a sanctuary of discipline, a space where every decision carries weight. Flight 593 also shifted public perception. The idea of visiting the cockpit during flight, once seen as charming or exciting, was universally abandoned. Airlines enforced locked doors not only as a security measure, but as a boundary protecting operational integrity. Passengers came to understand that the cockpit is not a place for casual interaction. It is a place where lives depend on structure. The legacy of Flight 593 extended far beyond Aeroflot. It became woven into aviation's broader philosophy that safety is never static. It evolves. It requires vigilance. It demands honesty about human limitations. The accident is still referenced by aviation psychologists studying stress, by engineers designing intuitive automation interfaces, and by CRM instructors explaining how leadership, communication, and mutual oversight prevent catastrophe. One instructor summarized the accident's impact with a statement that became widely quoted in the aviation community. Flight 593 taught us that professionalism cannot be suspended even for a moment. The sky does not forgive distraction. Back in the investigation archives, where the CVR and FDR now rest as sealed historical records. The final report closes with a sobering acknowledgement. The aircraft was airworthy, the weather benign, and the route routine. The disaster resulted solely from the intersection of human decision-making and misunderstood automation, a convergence that transformed a quiet night of cruise flight into tragedy. Yet the closing paragraphs offer a message of resilience. The lessons of Flight 593 did not stay confined to that night. They spread across continents, shaping safer skies for millions of passengers. They elevated CRM into a global standard. They strengthened automation awareness training. They reinforced cockpit discipline as a sacred directive. And in the final lines, the report conveys a message that resonates with the emotional core of aviation storytelling. Each tragedy writes a lesson into the sky, one that must be learned, carried forward, and never forgotten. Every flight that departs today, every crew that takes their seats behind the locked cockpit door, inherits those lessons. The voices of Flight 593, though silenced, continue speaking through every checklist, every cross-monitoring procedure, every moment a pilot hesitates before breaking protocol. Their legacy is alive in the vigilance that protects modern aviation. This is the enduring truth. Flying is safe because the industry refuses to forget. Each error becomes knowledge. Each tragedy becomes prevention. And each flight carries the weight of history, ensuring that the skies remain a place where discipline and humanity coexist in delicate balance.